Well, welcome to Jerusalem. As you heard a few moments ago, I had the privilege of studying here in Jerusalem before all of you were born. That was a program very similar to the Stand With Us conference, but it was a longer program. And that particular program focused, it was in between the 67 war and the 73 war, and that particular program focused on legal aspects of the Middle East conflict and comparative law of Israel and her neighbors. I must tell you, it was not, even though it was after the 67 war, it was not a very controversial time. It was a very peaceful time. We stayed in hotels in East Jerusalem. We walked the streets of East Jerusalem as students from all over the world. We did so without fear, and we did so without trepidation. We also didn't fear terrorism at that particular time. Today, it's different. Let me talk to you about how terrorism has evolved, and let me talk with you today about my own case study experiences in using legal remedies to hold sponsors of terror responsible. And of course, I will answer any question you have on any subject. The United States is the leading jurisdiction in the world where victims of terror can bring actions against governments that sponsor terrorism. Every government in the world has, in almost every law-abiding country, they enjoy what's called sovereign immunity. That means immunity from prosecution because of their diplomatic status, but also because countries reciprocate with one another, and they have, in each country, as a general rule, they have immunity. In the United States, we have a statute called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, short form FSIA. The Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act is legislation that's been on the books in the United States for ages and gives protection to every country from prosecution, except under certain exceptions. And one of those exceptions is what's called the commercial exception. And that means if a country does business with some person or another country, they can be sued for violating their contractual obligations. But another exception in the United States is what we call the terrorism exception, and that's what I'm going to focus in on for a few moments. Under the terrorism exception, countries which are listed by the U.S. Department of State as state sponsors of terror can be sued in U.S. federal courts on behalf of American victims of terror. So for the last decade, our law firm, Heidemann, Noodleman & Kalek in Washington, D.C., working with other law firms, have been bringing actions against various governments for sponsoring terror. I'm going to share with you three particular case studies dealing with three particular governments. First and foremost, I'm going to talk about Syria, because Syria was placed on the U.S. State Department list of state sponsors of terror in 1979 for their rampant sponsorship of terror under the Assad regime, being Assad the father as opposed to Bashar Assad the son. So since 1979, the Syrian Arab Republic has been on the U.S. Department of State list of state sponsors of terror. And therefore, since this legislation has been in effect with the terrorism exception, cases have been able to be brought against Syria. As of 2000, the year 2000, there were 7 countries on the U.S. State Department list of state sponsors of terror. Those 7 countries were Syria, Libya, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, the Sudan, and Cuba. By the end of President George W. Bush's administration, Iraq had been removed after the fall of Saddam Hussein, and the new government being put in place, and the beginnings of the democratization and rule of law process in Iraq. And I'm not going to spend the time to go through the nuances of what happened with cases that were already filed and pending prior to the time that Iraq was removed from the list, nor am I going to go into the nuances of what about sponsorship of terrorism of cases that had occurred prior to Iraq being removed from the list. But what is important is that once Iraq was removed from the list, and the Congress took certain steps, and the White House took certain steps, and the President signed an executive order, Iraq no longer could be sued under the terrorism exception to the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act. The second country to be removed during the Bush administration from the State Department list is Libya, and I will share with you in a few moments case studies about how it is, through a confluence of efforts by trial lawyers, by the White House, by the Congress, by the State Department, by international diplomacy, that Libya ended up being removed in 2008 from the list of state sponsors of terror. And right at the end of the Bush administration, North Korea was removed. It's always been a strange question to many of us as to why the White House chose to remove North Korea. And as we look at North Korea's activities over the last 5 years, there are many questions as to whether North Korea should have been removed. But the President of the United States had that right, working with the Secretary of State and the Congress, and therefore North Korea was also removed. That leaves presently on the list the other 4 countries, the primary and worst state sponsor of terror in the world being the Islamic Republic of Iran, plus the other 3 countries that I mentioned to you. So that leaves Syria, that leaves Cuba, and that leaves North Korea. So let me go back to where I opened up this subject, Syria. Syria has been on the list since 1979. Is it any wonder that the country that has been on the State Department list of state sponsors of terror longer than any other country in the world from being on the original list has turned against her own people? There should be no wonder and no amazement. The tragedy is that there's almost 1 million Syrian refugees and the world hasn't cared. The tragedy is that 100,000 people have died and the world has done nothing. And now we see evidence coming forth of Syria having used Syrian-based chemical weapons on her own people. She can blame, the Assad regime can say it was the rebels who did it. I have no belief that the rebels used chemical weapons against innocent Syrian civilians, because I believe that it's in keeping with the conduct of the Assad regime, which has been a repressor of human rights, a destroyer of dissent, and a country that has sponsored every major foreign terrorist organization in the world for decades. Therefore, it should be no surprise that the Assad regime has turned on her own people out of desperation, and how dastardly that people have died by the use of chemical weapons. I call upon President Obama to immediately go into Syria and put a stop, working with the rest of the world, whether the United Nations agrees or not. Go in and save those lives. Because the President of the United States, who takes great pride in his commitment to civil justice, his commitment to social justice, his commitment to humanitarian concerns and human rights concerns, it is unconscionable that during the Obama administration, over these last years, 1 million refugees are out of Syria, 100,000 people are dead, and now people have died by the use of chemical weapons, and President Obama himself, using the same term that Prime Minister Netanyahu used at the United Nations, talking about the Islamic Republic of Iran not crossing the red line as it relates to weapons of mass destruction in terms of nuclear weapons. President Obama subsequently used the same term, red line. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, not quoting, that it is a red line for the president, a red line for the United States of America, should the Assad regime use chemical weapons on her own people. Well, the evidence appears to me to be clear. I don't believe we can wait for the United Nations to act, because the United Nations knows how to dither. They do not know how to solve problems. They do not know how to save lives. And therefore, on behalf of the people of the Syrian Arab Republic, no matter which religion or which movement within any religion they may observe, the world has to immediately go into Syria, and I propose that Syria be mandated to become a no-fly zone, the same way that other countries, such as Libya, such as Iraq, such as Libya, became no-fly zones. What does that mean? Put up American Air Force, the greatest Air Force in the world, pull in the allies who are also threatened, like the Air Force from Turkey and other air forces from Europe, pull in NATO, and put a stop to any attacks from the air by the Assad regime. I remind you what I've said now multiple times. Syria is one of the worst states that sponsor terror in the world. They have acted with impunity using terrorism against Israel, terrorism against Americans, terrorism against anybody, including Europeans and others who have chosen to stand up for freedom, and therefore, why should we be shocked that Syria has turned on her own people? The fact that Russia and China at the United Nations in the Security Council have said they do not join a coalition of other countries at the Security Council to put sanctions on Syria or to stop Syria from doing anything is just unconscionable, and we cannot wait for Russia, which has its own interests. Because Russia has moved ships into the Mediterranean, and Russia needs a Mediterranean port, and Russia props up the regime of Assad in Syria. We cannot wait for China, which has its own global interests, because China will not join with the rest of the world, so it appears, to put a stop to this bloodshed in Syria. And then we have the issue of Iran. Iran uses Syria as a transit point to go across with weapons, to go across with munitions and missiles, to go across with Iranian Revolutionary Guards, not only into Syria, helping to kill people, but also going across into Lebanon. Lebanon is not on the State Department list of state sponsors of terror, but Lebanon houses Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, as you all know, is listed in the United States as a foreign terrorist organization. The European Union recently named Hezbollah as a foreign terrorist organization, but only Hezbollah's military wing, distinguishing between what the EU perceives to be a difference between charitable humanitarian work of Hezbollah and military or terrorist activities of Hezbollah. I don't know how you can make such a distinction, because to me a murderer is a murderer, to me a terrorist is a terrorist, and I don't believe that somebody can wear two hats or dance at two weddings at the same time in two different cities. And therefore it seems to me that the European Union should be mandated to reconvene on the issue of Hezbollah and see to it that Hezbollah is indeed branded as a full-scale foreign terrorist organization, the same way that the United States has done. Syria served as the base for Hezbollah. Syria served as the base for Hamas. Syria served as the base for Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Syria served as the base for Abu Nidal, the famous terrorist organization. Syria hosted the Abu Nidal organization in safe houses in Damascus and allowed Abu Nidal terrorists to be trained under the watchful eye of Syrian military and Air Force intelligence. And Syria provided free passage to Abu Nidal terrorists to move around Syria, over into Lebanon, through the Bekaa Valley, where they were trained in terrorist training camps, out to Europe to commit atrocities that I'll discuss with you in a moment. And Abu Nidal was sponsored by Syria and also sponsored by Libya. This isn't just me saying these things. U.S. federal court judges, in response to lawsuits that we have filed in federal court in the United States, particularly in Washington, D.C., have found Syria to be a state sponsor of terror, and have found in judgments that Syria sponsored the Abu Nidal terrorist organization, and have found that Syria sponsored the Abu Nidal terrorists that actually committed specific terrorist acts over which we sued Syria and Libya. So let me talk about the two countries together now. The first case we sued about is referred to as Egypt Air Flight 648. It was an airplane that took off from Athens on its way to Cairo, November 23rd, 1985, just before Thanksgiving, probably again before most of you were born. And in fact, there was a shootout on the airplane mid-air as the plane was going from Athens to Cairo. And this shootout took place between Egypt Air, because it was an Egypt Air flight, Egypt Air air marshals, and Abu Nidal terrorists. Did any of you give any thought to the fact that as far back as 1985, airplanes were being hijacked, weapons in the form of Kalashnikovs were able to get onto those airplanes, that there would be an Egypt Air Marshal in 1985 on airplanes because of terrorism back then. As a result of the shootout, the plane landed in Malta. The terrorists collected everybody's passports. The terrorists took the 3 Americans and 2 Israeli women and put them into first class. And as they were letting people off the airplane, one country at a time, they called forward at a certain moment. The first Israeli woman, she reached out for her passport. They put a gun to her head and blew her brains out. They did the same with the second Israeli woman. They then did the same with the 3 Americans, 2 of whom survived. One of the Israeli women, by the way, also survived. I've interviewed the Israeli woman who survived. I represent the Americans who survived and the estate of the woman who died.